Good morning, everyone. My name is Henrietta. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today with Neil and Carl. Today, we are going to talk about crisis management in ethnic communities when it comes to terrorism, as well as heightened level of threats in the communities. I feel very privileged to be here today because this is a new topic for me. So if you are also a community leader and want to learn more, please stick around. We're making sure that our language that we use today is going to be around and absorb, it's going to be a language that we can all understand and hopefully learn from, because we need to learn from the past. And today we are joined by the two big veterans of this topic. But first, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. And I would like to extend this acknowledgement to the land of the traditional owners of on your side, Neil.
Okay, thank you, Henrietta. Great to be a part of this project, and especially to team up with Carl. So it's been a while. So as a way of a background, I recently served as the CEO of the Peak Muslim body in Victoria, representing and speaking on behalf of about 3% of Victoria's population. And during my 8 years, you could say that we've had our fair share of crisis after crisis. So when it comes to a matter of how do we define community-led crisis management, sometimes I'm inclined to think that it's more a mismanagement than a management. And I echo what you say. There's a lot to learn from one another, and that's critical. And sometimes what tends to happen is that the experiences, the wisdoms gained by each particular community is not shared. And it's not benefiting or hasn't benefited other communities. So there's a lot that we could learn from one another in order to try and offset or prevent future similar experiences.
Thank you so much, Neil. And Carl?
Oh, thank you, Henny, and thanks for having us, and thank you, Neil. Yes, I want to pick up on that point, how important it is that we all share from each other. My background is working in community policy and advocacy. I have had government roles quite a long time ago, and then I sort of swapped into working for community peaks. And I also worked in Victoria, in Melbourne, Victoria. I got to know Neil while I was working there for the state-funded multicultural peak organisation, and then I also worked for 6 months with him at his Muslim peak organisation during the secondment. So that was it was a particular period of a lot of social cohesion, counter-terrorism activity. So how that affected the community, I had no experience of before that happened. So I'd had government experience and I'd had community policy and advocacy experience, but I'd had nothing that sort of compared to that sort of intense 3-year period. And like Neil, I also think that I've been thinking a lot about, it's such a shame we gather all that experience and then we don't share it with other people. and most importantly, this idea that really different communities who are sometimes pitched against each other, like today it's religious faith organizations pitched against LGBTI, trans, pitched against religious organizations. And yet when it comes to community safety and what they all need, and what they've all learned, I think there are communities that may not get on in the public sphere, but they have so much to give each other in terms of teaching each other how to increase their personal and community protection. So
thank you so much on that, and I think this is why this conversation is happening right now. So the way I actually met with Carl, I'm working in the community development sphere in Perth, so I'm working with a lot of ethnic communities, and I know a lot of the leaders. And I remember in a very early this year early on, obviously the Ukrainian war broke out, and because I'm connected to the Eastern European communities, I started seeing what's happening in that community, and I sort of reached out in LinkedIn and I said, guys, does anybody know what to do in this scenario? Like, there's an old and established community that is actually aging out, all of a sudden found themselves in a situation where their home country or country of origin is in a turmoil. I really thought back then that based on the Afghan war, based on the Burmese issue, based on a lot of other stuff before, we actually managed to handle these kind of crisis situations in ethnic groups who are in the ground in Australia. As it turned out, that was not the case. So, but Carl came forward and sort of done me a crash course on crisis communication. And I think ever since, that's where we really started working together, because it's so much to learn from you. So only just from that era, I felt that I was empowered, and I felt like I was able to help, even if just with, you know, words and just directing or giving advice to those communities that found themselves in crisis. But that was really great. And a couple of weeks ago, we started talking about some of the incidences, as you said, that's happening in the community right now in regards to some jerseys. And then sort of those as you said it as well, it's not just one incident, it's that when incidents are very close together and then they sort of snowball into a crisis situation, and sometimes it snowballs so quickly. Like the Ukrainian-Russian war didn't happen like this. We know they're preparing, we know that was happening, but it was snowballing into a crisis situation. And when we were already in that moment, it was too late to prevent, to prepare, to get together. People were in distress, people were in sort of all sorts of emotions. So that was not as similar, obviously, as a terrorist attack or what happened here a couple of years ago in Australia, but it was similar in that way, that it was a crisis. Communities were impacted, and a lot of people from government to leadership or community leadership didn't know what to do. So today, that's why I think this conversation will be really good to share your experience that when during a terrorist incident, how do communities and governments respond? What your experience is on that different level when these kind of things happen?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Henrietta. So I think it all starts with how we define things, okay? And how do we define community? How do we define leadership? How do we define a crisis? And I don't think that there is any one set definition, and you know, it's fluid and it changes according to the current dynamics. With regards to the Muslim community in particular, responding to the whole era of counterterrorism, it was I would say it wasn't a response, but it's a reaction, because the community space is a reactive space, okay? And that's very, very important for people to understand. Even within community, people don't realize that even if you have been trained, to be a community leader, when you actually are in a leadership role, not very often that you are entitled to be proactive. You're constantly reacting to the needs, the wants of you from other entities. And in a way, the government also reacts. Okay, so you would expect that the governments to be more proactive, more prepared, because they have got the accumulated wisdom, they've got the resources, they're mandated to take on such a responsibility. So with regards to the Muslim community's reactions, it was I would say it was complicated, and what I guess complicated matters was that it wasn't a one-off incident. Okay, it was a series. It was like days of our lives. It didn't stop. One incident after another. And look, there was a lot of support because our society, whether we call it, multicultural policies, social cohesion was at risk. A lot of groups needed to work together, but that in itself took quite a while to understand and to develop, to have a plan, to have a strategy, to have coordination. And only, I would say that it became a bigger agenda once the threat or perceptions of threats was beyond the Muslim community. So if it was, I would say that if the problem was a Muslim problem contained within the Muslim community, it would have been a different reaction. But when it became a broader societal problem, that's when other parties, other entities needed to be part of working towards a solution. There's been a lot of reviews, a lot of consultations. There's been a lot of learnings, but as with all research and consultations reports, they tend to be lost amongst all the other reports because we've moved on to the next problem, to the next crisis. And in recent times, if I may add, we seem to be having a crisis after a crisis. These days, everything tends to be a crisis, whether it's a financial crisis, it's a health crisis, it's a housing crisis, you name it. We could list 24 crises at this particular moment. So the previous crisis tends to be forgotten about, okay, and we tend to shift to the next crisis unprepared, and starting from scratch. So I would say, it was a poorly managed reaction. However, an essential response by all that have been all who are concerned to ensure that our way of life, our social cohesion is not disrupted. However, we tend to fail to learn the lessons from how we manage the previous crisis.
Thank you, Neil. And that's what I found when I tried to reach out for help for the Ukrainian community. I was like 100% sure we already got this going. This is not the first crisis. These are, not the first time we had refugees coming in from a country because all of a sudden it's a war. And then I learned that as actually was no guidelines, no support, not everything was reactionary. And unfortunately, it came out of the way that one group was supported better like this, while other ones didn't get the same, quick visa access and so forth. So that was a really, I was very shocked about how much we didn't learn from previous crises.